So I chose to do my paper on the Mormons in Jackson County, focusing on their expulsion. I chose this topic because I live in Independence, Missouri. I didn't grow up in Kansas City, but I've lived there for about 6 years. And Independence is a great city if you love history because it's thick with history, especially Mormon history. I did not grew up around Mormons. I don't know very much about the Mormon religion, so I thought this was a good excuse to kind of dig into the history of my adopted hometown. So in 1830s, this is when the Mormon religion started. It's a very young religion. It was under the prophet Joseph Smith. It's created out east, but as they gathered converts, they moved to Midwest, like to places like Kirtland, Ohio, Nauvoo, Illinois, and Jackson County, Missouri. So as we've learned in previous lectures, Jackson County back then was wide open for settlement, full of outlaws and rabble-rousers. And so the Mormons moved in, and they're quiet and industrious people. They believe in not only the second coming of Christ, but the speedy second coming of Christ. So they built up a society very quickly, printing presses, shops, getting themselves settled, and getting themselves prepared. So one of the reasons they started to move west from out east is they believe that thousands of years ago the Israelites came to America from Jerusalem, and that Native Americans were the descendants of those Israelites. So they wanted to move west to preach to what they thought were their descendants, the Native Americans. The other reason was they got chased out of a lot of places. So when you learn about the early religion, some of it was religious, persecution, and they got chased out for who they were. But some of the other reasons was some not so holy actions taken by their leadership. So there was a failed attempt to create their own bank and currency that left creditors and debtors in their wake, and the America at the time was full of these traveling evangelists that were thought of as con artists, and Joseph Smith got the reputation very quickly as just being another one of the con artists. So Mormons do believe in the Old and the New Testaments of the Bible, and they do consider themselves Christians. They participate heavily in evangelism and missionary work, and they are very, very organized. So they acquired converts very quickly, and the converts moved into Jackson County. Most of their converts were from abolitionist northern states and places like Canada. So again, you have these people coming in, building up a society very quickly, buying large tracts of land, and bringing in what were thought of as abolitionist settlers. Most of the people that lived there, the Jackson County settlers, they had moved there from Tennessee, Virginia. A lot of them had slaves with them. So it was just more fuel for the fire. So by 1832, things were kind of really coming to a head. So one of the big things is Joseph Smith promised them that the land in that area would be theirs as an inheritance anyway. And I think this is more the exception than the rule, but there was a story that John McCoy, famous John McCoy, says of a Mormon that used to call on Isaac McCoy all the time and tell him that he was going to inherit Isaac McCoy's home, and that had been allotted to him by divine authority. In the Lord's good time, he would possess it. So can you imagine somebody knocking on your door and saying, by the way, your house is going to be mine eventually. So by 1833, the locals were organizing to drive the Mormons from the country. So an agreement was signed by hundreds of settlers and officials, and people like the judge, the sheriff, the jailer, the county clerk. So while it wasn't a government act, it had the illusion of being sanctioned by the government due to the people that signed it. So they were saying that due to the evils being imposed on them by the Mormons and the law's inability to do anything about it, they decided to do it themselves. So they charged the Mormons as an evil religion, tampering with slaves, encouraging free Negroes to immigrate to the area, and boasting that they would have all the land in the county as their inheritance. None of the charges were truly justified or accepted practices by the Mormons as a whole. The agreement demanded that no more Mormons were allowed to settle, the printing house and Mormon shops must be closed, and that the Mormons must leave. If they left in peace, they would be given ample time to take care of their property, which they were not. So they, after telling that, the settlers tore down the printing press, destroyed homes and crops, and tarred and feathered a Mormon bishop. So while the Mormons believed God was on their side and was going to give them these lands someday anyway, they also knew their rights and pursued legal actions by hiring Alexander Donovan. He appealed to Governor Duncan at the time to send in troops to help defend the Mormons and their right to worship. The governor would have none of it. He didn't want to send in troops. He said, go through your civil courts. We're not sending in troops. Well, Justice of the Peace, being one of the signers of the agreement, was not going to hear anything the Mormons had to say. So they basically had, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to kind of condense some of the other actions, but they were forced to flee into Clay County. They lived in Clay County for a while, again, built up very quickly, established church, and ran into problems there. So again, they bring in Alexander Donovan. He gets with the state of Missouri and gets Caldwell and Daviess counties to be established as just Mormon counties. And they were allowed to move there. They were not allowed to settle in any other county without consent of 2/3 of the non-Mormon citizens. So they moved into this county and again ran into problems. So while the Mormons were peaceful, they were not Quakers. They were not pacifists. So they were not afraid to defend themselves. So they took up arms. There's a famous Salt sermon where they were called to action to take up arms to defend themselves. A sermon that was put on pamphlets and leaflets and distributed. So there's problems happening down in what they called Far West. But by this time there was a new governor. His name was Lilburn Boggs. And he proclaimed that the Mormons had made war and had issued what is now known as the Extermination Order. So basically this said that the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public good. So the order was illegal, basically, but it came down from the government and went to none other than Alexander Donovan, who was not only a lawyer but a brigadier general. There's a lot of interviews with him. He completely dismissed it because he knew it was illegal. But because of this, he's credited as the man who refused to execute Joseph Smith. So he's a very revered man in the Mormon religion. There's actually a camp in Excelsior Springs that they use for retreats called Camp Donovan. So while there were severe critics of the Mormon religion, word spread of the atrocities that were committed against the Mormons as far as every time they settled someplace, their things getting burned to the ground and turning them into a poverty and migrant type of people. So, there was something to be said. The Mormons, they felt they were persecuted everywhere they went. And then you had the state saying, well, you guys are troublemakers and you want to take over these lands illegally. So there was a lot of flared emotion and, zealots on both sides that made this issue a lot worse than it probably should have been. But after watching these people go from Jackson County to Clay County to Ray County, the feelings towards the Mormons by the Jackson Countyans were not held by all. And although difficult to quantify, there seems to have been a general sympathy for the plight of the Mormons. The Mormons endured a lot. There were some things done by their leadership, but they endured a lot. So I believe that there's a lot of parallels between this issue and the beginnings of the war between the states of Kansas, abolitionist Kansas, and slaveholding Missouri, which is a whole nother topic. But you read these texts and it all seems really familiar as far as how that was fought and some of the fuel on the fire that started some of this stuff. So anyway, I appreciate your time and I can't wait to see the rest of the presentations. Thanks.